Most people believe that the moment you die, everything is decided, heaven, hell, judgment, a final outcome that begins right there, at the exact moment life ends. And that assumption seems obvious until you look at what the earliest texts actually say. Because according to those texts, that moment doesn't actually decide anything. What they describe is something very different. Not a system that begins when the body stops, not something that activates when consciousness fades, but something already in place, already defined, before death even occurs. And that changes the model entirely, because if that structure already exists, if the soul enters it immediately, then whatever position it takes within that structure cannot be decided there. It has to be recognized, and that distinction carries a consequence most people never consider. It means that what happens after death is not the beginning of something new. It is the continuation of something that was already forming. The Ethiopian Bible preserves one of the only detailed accounts of this structure, and in the Book of Enoch, what is described is not abstract. It is divided, organized, defined by separations that do not change once a soul arrives. 4 distinct chambers, not forming at the moment of death, not assigned through a process, already differentiated. And the difference between them is not explained as a verdict. It is explained as a condition, something the soul carries into that reality before it ever reaches it. That same pattern appears again in Luke 16, not as metaphor, but as structure, a separation already fixed, a distance that cannot be crossed, a condition already defined at the moment of arrival, no tribunal, no delay, no transition from uncertainty to decision. Which means the question is no longer whether judgment exists. It does. The question is what role it actually plays. Because if the soul arrives already positioned, already separated, already aligned with a specific condition, then judgment is not determining that outcome. It is confirming it. And if it only confirms something already formed, then that formation is happening somewhere else, not after death, before it. And that forces a different question entirely. If judgment doesn't begin after death, then what actually does? The model most people carry looks like this. Life ends. Something happens, a transition, a crossing, a moment of passing. And on the other side of that moment, a process begins. The soul is evaluated, a record is examined, a decision is rendered. And based on that decision, a destination is assigned. It is a clean model, it has internal logic, it resolves uncertainty, and it explains everything in a single sequence, which is precisely why it goes unquestioned. Because a model that explains everything too cleanly often hides what it cannot account for. And that is where the problem begins, not in the conclusion, but in the structure itself. Because when you return to the sources that predate that model, not the tradition built around them, but the documents themselves, what you find is not a courtroom waiting to open. What you find is something that does not follow that sequence at all. The oldest Hebrew conception of what happens after death does not describe judgment as an immediate event. Sheol, as it appears across the Hebrew texts, is not a place of verdict. It is not where cases are heard. It is not where outcomes are determined. It is a collective space, undifferentiated in its earliest descriptions, defined by presence, but not by resolution. The word itself carries no built-in verdict. It carries location, containment, a below, but not a sentence. That absence matters, because if the dominant model were accurate, if death were the threshold where judgment begins, then that structure would be visible from the beginning. It would not appear later. It would not emerge gradually. It would already be there, but it isn't. What appears instead is something more ambiguous. A holding, a waiting, a condition that exists, but is not yet resolved in the way the modern model requires, which introduces a gap. And that gap is not explained by the inherited framework. It is exposed by it. And then the Book of Enoch introduces something the earlier texts do not make explicit: internal differentiation. Not one space, but 4. Not a uniform condition, but distinct separations, distinct states. And critically, states that the text does not present as temporary. They are not described as assignments pending review. They are described as positions, already occupied. already corresponding to something the soul brought with it. That shift is not cosmetic. It changes the logic entirely, because in the inherited model, the soul arrives at death in a neutral condition, undetermined, awaiting process. But in the structure Enoch describes, the soul is not neutral. It is already differentiated, already located within a framework that does not appear to be waiting for external input to function, which produces a direct conflict, not at the level of interpretation, but at the level of sequence. If judgment is what determines outcome, and the soul arrives already positioned, then one of two things must be true. Either the judgment happened before death, or judgment is not what determines the position. One option dismantles the timeline, the other dismantles the function, and both possibilities come from the same text, which means the model most people rely on cannot hold in its current form. And if it doesn't hold, then something else has to replace it. And that is where the structure begins to change. To understand what the Book of Enoch is describing, you have to understand what preceded it, not as background, as contrast. Because the structure Enoch introduces only becomes significant when placed against what the earlier Hebrew texts actually say, and more precisely, against what they deliberately do not say. That absence is not incidental. It is structural. The Hebrew Bible does not present a unified, developed theology of the afterlife. That is not a controversial claim. It is a textual observation that holds across multiple books, multiple genres, and multiple centuries of composition. What it presents instead is something more limited and more revealing, a word, a concept, a location referenced repeatedly without ever being fully defined. Sheol. The term appears more than 60 times across the Hebrew texts, in Job, in Psalms, in Proverbs, and in the prophetic literature. And in each context, it functions consistently as a destination, but not as a verdict. It is described as below, as deep, as a place the living do not return from. It receives the dead, but it does not evaluate them. The righteous go there, the unrighteous go there. Figures of moral weight and figures of moral failure arrive at the same location, described in the same terms, with no textual indication that their condition within it differs in any meaningful way. That uniformity matters, because it does not align with the model most people assume. It reflects a conception of death that does not yet contain the architecture that model requires. There is no separation described, no differentiation of condition, no indication that Sheol functions as a place where outcomes are assigned or where a prior life is evaluated against a standard. What it contains in its earliest descriptions is simply the dead, present, contained, defined by their arrival, not by what happens after it. And that creates a structural problem. Because the inherited model requires that death function as a threshold, a point at which the undetermined becomes determined. But Sheol does not behave like that threshold. It behaves like a continuation. The dead are there. They are not elsewhere. They are not being processed. They are not described as moving toward resolution. And the text offers no mechanism by which their condition within that space is resolved into something more specific. That gap is not a minor omission. It is a missing function. And the Hebrew canon does not attempt to fill it. It preserves it. There are passages in the Psalms that treat Sheol as a place of absence, from God, from praise, from the activity of the living. There are passages in Job that use it as a frame for the finality of death, without implying that finality carries a moral structure. And there are passages in the prophetic texts that reference it in contexts of judgment, but those references describe Sheol as a destination for groups or nations, not as a mechanism of individual evaluation. That distinction matters because it limits what those texts are actually doing. The individual dimension, the question of what happens to a specific soul in a specific condition based on a specific formation, is not what the earliest Hebrew texts are primarily addressing. Which means that when Enoch introduces 4 chambers, each with distinct conditions, each already occupied by souls in differentiated states, it is not adding detail to an existing structure. It is solving a problem the earlier texts leave open. And in doing so, It introduces a different kind of logic entirely, one the earlier texts do not contain, and one the inherited model still does not fully account for. The Book of Enoch does not describe the afterlife as something unclear. It describes it as something already organized, and that distinction changes how everything that follows has to be read, because a mystery invites interpretation, but a structure does not. A structure demands explanation, and what Enoch presents, in the section known as the Book of the Watchers, preserved in full only within the Ethiopian canon, is not a symbolic vision meant to be interpreted freely. It is a description with internal logic, a layout, a division, something already functioning when he sees it. That is where the shift happens, not in belief, in what the text actually shows. In chapter 22 of 1 Enoch, the description is precise. Enoch is taken to a mountain. Inside it he sees hollow places, chambers, spaces that are described as having been made to receive the spirits of the dead, and the explanation that follows does not describe a process unfolding. It describes a condition that already exists, 4 chambers, each distinct, each corresponding to a different state, not forming, not being assigned, already separated. That detail is easy to overlook, but it is where the entire structure shifts, because if the separation is already there, then the differentiation did not begin at the moment of placement. It existed before it. The first chamber contains the spirits of the righteous. They are described in a condition of light, not as a future reward, as a present state. There is no indication that this condition is temporary, no indication that it is pending review. It is presented as stable. The second and third chambers contain the unrighteous. But even here, the text does not collapse them into a single category. It distinguishes between those who were not punished during life and those who were. That distinction matters because it introduces something the inherited model does not account for: gradation. Not just moral classification, condition, something more specific than righteous or unrighteous, something tied to the actual state of the soul. The fourth chamber, depending on manuscript tradition, contains those whose condition does not resolve cleanly into either category, which complicates the structure even further, because it removes the possibility of a simple binary and replaces it with a spectrum. But across all 4 chambers, one fact remains constant. The souls are already there, already separated, already positioned, and nothing in the text suggests that this positioning is temporary. That is where most interpretations begin to shift away from what the text actually says, because the common reading treats these chambers as a waiting area, a pre-judgment space, a temporary condition before something final happens. But the text does not describe waiting, it describes placement. And those are not the same thing. Waiting implies uncertainty. Placement implies recognition, which leads to a problem the inherited model cannot easily resolve. If the souls are already differentiated, already aligned with specific conditions, then what exactly is judgment doing? Because in the inherited model, judgment produces the outcome. But here, the outcome is already visible, already structured, already present, which means judgment is not creating that condition, it is confirming it, and that is a different function entirely. The difference between producing and confirming is not a semantic distinction, it is structural. It means the soul does not arrive as something undecided. It arrives as something already formed, not waiting to become something else, but entering a structure that reveals what it already is. Enoch does not explain how that formation happens. He does not describe the mechanism behind it. He does not tell you what determines the condition of the soul before death. He shows you the result. 4 chambers, already differentiated, already occupied, already reflecting something carried into that structure. And that single detail, that the soul is not being judged there but placed, is what makes the structure Enoch describes incompatible with the model most people carry. Not partially, completely. The structure Enoch describes does not remain isolated. It appears again, not in the same language, not in the same form, but in the same logic. And that is what makes it difficult to dismiss. Because if the 4 chambers appeared only in an apocryphal text, preserved in one canon, debated across traditions, it would be possible to treat the structure as peripheral, something interesting, but not central. But the logic does not stay there. It surfaces again inside the canonical text, in a passage attributed directly to Jesus. Luke 16. The passage is familiar. A rich man, a poor man named Lazarus. Both die. And what follows is not a process unfolding. It is a condition already fixed. Lazarus is carried to Abraham's side. The rich man arrives in Hades in a state of torment, and the exchange that follows contains a detail that most readings move past too quickly. The rich man does not ask to be judged again. He does not appeal to a process still in motion. He does not argue his case. He asks for water. That request is not incidental. It reveals an assumption. It assumes that the condition he is in is already settled, not pending, not negotiable, already defined. Abraham's response confirms it, not by referencing a verdict, but by pointing to a structure. Between us and you, a great gulf has been fixed. That word, fixed, is doing more than describing distance. It defines permanence. It defines irreversibility. It defines a condition that cannot be altered by anything that happens after this point, which means the separation does not begin here. It is revealed here. And that distinction matters, because if the separation were the result of a judgment still in process, it would not be described as fixed. It would be described as pending. But it isn't. It is already in place, already impassable, already determining what is possible and what is not, which places Luke 16 in direct structural alignment with what Enoch describes. Not identical in detail, not dependent on the same framework, but operating on the same premise. A soul arrives. A condition is already present. A separation is already in place. And nothing in the scene suggests that this is temporary. Nothing suggests that it is waiting to be resolved. That alignment is not incidental. It removes a possible objection. Because the structure Enoch describes can no longer be dismissed as isolated. The same logic appears in the canon, in a passage attributed to Jesus, using the same structural principle. There is an interpretation that attempts to preserve the inherited model here. It treats Luke 16 as a parable, not a description, a story, not a structure. And on the surface, that seems sufficient. But it introduces a problem, because the force of the story depends on its structure being real. The rich man's request only makes sense if the separation is absolute. His inability to cross only matters if the boundary is actual. His appeal is denied not because of narrative convenience, but because the condition is fixed. Remove that structural reality, and the passage collapses into incoherence, which means the structure cannot be dismissed without weakening the text itself. And that leaves the underlying premise intact. The soul does not arrive in an undetermined state. Something is already present. Something already defines its position. And what happens after death does not create that condition. It reveals it. When that premise appears in both Enoch and Luke 16, in both an apocryphal text and a canonical one, the issue is no longer interpretation. It is convergence. Two independent sources describing the same structural reality, without relying on each other, without sharing language, but arriving at the same conclusion. And that conclusion does not match the model most people rely on, which means the gap is not theoretical, it is textual, and it is larger than most people realize. At this point, the problem can no longer be avoided, because two things are now clearly established, and they do not fit inside the same model. The first, judgment exists. It is present in both traditions. It is not being questioned here. The texts that describe the four chambers also reference a final judgment. Luke 16 exists within a broader canonical framework where judgment is a real and coming event. That is not in dispute. The second, the soul does not arrive in a neutral condition. It arrives already positioned, already differentiated, already reflecting something the structure it enters does not create, but receives. Those two facts do not cancel each other, but they do create a contradiction, not between the texts and the model used to read them, because the inherited model assigns judgment a specific role. It is the event that determines outcome. The soul arrives. The process begins. The verdict is rendered. The condition is assigned. That sequence depends on something essential. It depends on uncertainty. The soul must arrive undetermined. There must be something left to decide, something not yet fixed. Without that, judgment has no function. Without something to resolve, the entire sequence collapses. But that is not what the texts describe. They do not describe an undetermined soul. They describe a soul that arrives already carrying its condition, already separated, already placed, already aligned with a specific state, not waiting to become something else, but entering a structure that reflects what it already is, which means the function the inherited model assigns to judgment cannot be correct, not partially incorrect, structurally incompatible. Something has to give. There are only two ways to resolve that conflict. The first is to preserve the model and reinterpret the texts around it. Treat the chambers in Enoch as symbolic. Treat the fixed gulf in Luke 16 as narrative. Reduce structure to illustration. That approach is not irrational. It has been the dominant response for centuries. It produces a system that is stable, coherent, easy to transmit, but it comes with a cost that is often not stated explicitly. The cost is that the texts must be read against themselves. The specificity in Enoch becomes unnecessary. The structure becomes decorative. The internal logic becomes secondary to the model imposed on it. The same is true in Luke 16. The separation, the irreversibility, the fixed gulf. These are not peripheral details. They are the elements that make the passage function. Remove them as structure, and the passage no longer holds together. It becomes illustration without mechanism, which leaves the second option. Allow the texts to reshape the model, not partially, not selectively, structurally. And that requires a different question. Not, when does judgment happen? But, what does judgment actually do? Because if the soul arrives already positioned, if the condition is already formed, then judgment is not the beginning of a process. It is the end of one. Not the event that creates the outcome, but the event that finalizes it, seals it, confirms it, makes it irreversible. That shift does not remove judgment. It redefines it. And once that function changes, everything else follows. Because if judgment confirms what is already formed, then the formation is the event that matters, not the confirmation. And if the formation is what matters, then the real question is no longer about what happens after death. It is about what has already happened before it. That is the contradiction the inherited model cannot absorb, not because it is irrational, but because the text will not support the function it assigns to judgment. And once that function is removed, the model does not simply weaken, it collapses, and something else has to take its place. Once the inherited model collapses, the question is no longer whether it needs adjustment. It doesn't. It cannot be repaired by reinterpretation. It has to be replaced. And that replacement cannot come from speculation. It cannot come from theological preference or from systems built after the texts themselves. It has to come from the same sources that expose the problem, from the internal logic the texts already provide. And when that logic is followed, without importing assumptions the texts do not support, what emerges is not a new belief. It is a different sequence, a different account of what actually happens, in what order, and for what reason. Not a reinterpretation, a reordering. And that sequence resolves the contradiction without removing any of the elements the texts preserve. It does not eliminate judgment. It does not remove separation. It does not ignore the intermediate state. It places them in a different order. That sequence has 4 phases, not imposed on the text, not constructed to solve a problem, drawn from what the texts already describe. And once they are seen clearly, the structure stops being theoretical. It becomes unavoidable. The first phase is separation. Death is not the end of a process. It is an entry point into something that already exists. The soul does not arrive in a neutral space. It enters a differentiated one. The chambers Enoch describes are already present, already organized, already functioning, and what they receive is not a soul waiting to be defined. It is a soul already carrying a definition. The separation that occurs at death is not created there, it is revealed. Something internal becomes spatial. Something formed becomes visible. Something unseen becomes fixed in place. That is the first phase. Not judgment, exposure. The second phase is recognition. This is the part most models ignore. Between separation and any final resolution, the texts describe a moment that is neither passive nor procedural. It is not a verdict being delivered. It is an acknowledgement. In Enoch, this is embedded in the structure itself. Each chamber corresponds to a condition. The soul does not choose where it goes. It is placed, precisely, consistently, according to what it already is. In Luke 16, the same dynamic appears in dialogue. The rich man does not hear a sentence. He is shown a reality. He speaks from within it, and he recognizes it. The separation is not being decided. It is being acknowledged. Recognition is not judgment. It is the moment when what was formed becomes undeniable. The third phase is positioning. This is what the intermediate state actually is. Not a waiting room, not a temporary suspension, not a placeholder before something final happens. A real condition, with real differentiation, reflecting the actual state of the soul at the moment of death. The chambers are not provisional, they are accurate. What they contain is not awaiting revision, it is already aligned with what comes next. Because what comes next does not change the condition, it confirms it, which leads to the final phase, confirmation. This is what judgment actually does within this structure, not create the outcome, not decide between possibilities, not evaluate an undecided state. It finalizes. It renders permanent. It makes irreversible. It establishes what can no longer change. In a way, the intermediate state cannot be, because the intermediate state exists within time, and time still allows for relation, awareness, and distinction. Judgment marks the point where time no longer alters what the soul is. That is not a diminished role. It is a precise one. Judgment is not when the soul becomes something. It is when what the soul already is can no longer become anything else. That four-phase structure, separation, recognition, positioning, confirmation, is not a theological invention. It is what the texts describe when they are allowed to speak without the inherited model imposed on them, and it produces a coherent account. One that does not require the soul to arrive undetermined, does not require uncertainty at the point of death, and does not require judgment to do what it was never described as doing. The model holds, not because it is elegant, because it is consistent with the texts, and once that consistency is seen, the question changes, not what happens after death, but what has already been happening long before it. At a certain point, this stops being theoretical, not because the texts lose relevance, but because what they describe is not confined to them. It is already happening, not in the future, not at the moment of death. Now, because if the soul arrives already positioned, if the separation reflects a condition already formed, then that formation cannot belong to the future, it has to belong to the present. Which means the question the texts raise is not primarily about what happens after death. It is about what is already happening before it, and more specifically, what is happening now. Most people treat judgment as something deferred, something that belongs to a distant moment, final, decisive, separate from everything that is happening here. And within the inherited model, that assumption works, because if judgment produces the outcome, then it must come later. But within the structure the texts describe, that sequence no longer holds. Because if judgment confirms what is already formed, then formation is the decisive process, and formation is not deferred. It cannot be. It is continuous. It is happening now. In what is chosen, in what is repeated, in what is allowed to take root, not as isolated decisions, but as direction, because the texts do not describe the soul as the sum of individual moments. They describe it as something that moves, something that develops, something that takes shape over time. The soul that arrives already positioned did not become that position in a single event. It moved toward it, gradually, consistently, through a process that death does not begin, but reveals. And that is what the chambers represent, not punishment, not reward, not a verdict being applied, a revelation. The structure does not decide what the soul is. It shows what the soul became. And what the soul became is not determined by a single failure or a single decision. It is determined by direction, by what persists beneath individual moments, by what continues when nothing forces it to stop. That is what forms the condition the soul carries, and that condition is not adjusted when it enters the structure. It is received, exactly as it is, without revision, without negotiation, without the possibility of becoming something else at that point. Which means the implications of this structure are not primarily about the future. They are about the present. Because what is being formed now is not preparation for something later, it is the thing itself. And that changes what matters, not what will happen, but what is already happening. Because the structure the texts describe does not wait for the soul to become something, it reveals what it already is, and that is the difference the inherited model does not account for. Not judgment, revelation, not a verdict, exposure. And the distance between those is not abstract. It is the distance between what you assume will happen and what is already taking shape. The inherited model begins at the wrong point. It begins with death. It assumes that what matters most happens after, that the decisive moment is the one that arrives at the end, that everything before it is preparation, incomplete, provisional, waiting to be resolved. But that assumption is not supported by the texts. It never was. What the texts describe, from the earliest Hebrew conception of Sheol, through the 4 chambers in Enoch, through the fixed gulf in Luke 16, is not a system that activates at death. It is a structure that death makes visible. And that distinction does not adjust the model. It inverts it. Because if the structure already exists, if the soul arrives already formed, if the separation reflects a condition that preceded it, then death is not where something begins. It is where something ends. The process of formation, the window in which direction can still change, the period in which what the soul is becoming is not yet fixed. Death does not open the question, it closes it. Which means the judgment most people are waiting for has a different relationship to time than the inherited model assumes. It is not ahead. In the most structurally significant sense, it is already behind, not in the sense that it has already occurred, but in the sense that what it will confirm is already being determined. Now, not later, not at some distant point, now. The texts do not describe a moment where you finally become something. They describe a moment where what you became can no longer change. That is not judgment in the sense most people mean. It is revelation. And revelation does not wait. It does not decide. It does not negotiate. It does not adjust. It reveals completely, exactly as it is. And when it does, nothing about it is new. It is only visible. If the outcome is already forming, then what matters isn't later. It's now.